Dear friends, welcome back to Open Heart Conversations, where we come together as community to explore the world's enduring spiritual and religious traditions. I'm Reverend Dr. Jose Miguel Roman, Spiritual Counsel at the United Palace of Spiritual Arts, and I'm very happy to be joined by my co-host, Bishop Heather Shea, our Spiritual Director and Chief Executive Officer. Welcome back, Heather.
Thank you. Welcome back. It's great to be here this morning, and I'm particularly excited about Rabbi Guy being here with us today. So let's continue the conversation. Thank you.
Absolutely. Yes, absolutely. Today we will be exploring the Jewish tradition with our special guest, Rabbi Guy Austrian. Welcome, Rabbi.
Thank you so much. What a privilege to be here, and I look forward to an enjoyable conversation and really getting deep with both of you.
Well, the privilege is ours. Rabbi Guy Austrian joined the Fort Tryon Jewish Center as its rabbi and spiritual leader in January 2013. Rabbi Austrian entered the rabbinate to build communities of compassion and mitzvah observance that integrate deep prayer, serious Torah learning, authentic emotions of joy and grief, and a sacred aspiration for social change. After immigrating with his parents from Israel as a child, Rabbi Guy grew up in the Cleveland area. Aware of differences in language and culture from a very young age, he devoted his early career to helping Jews build partnerships with diverse communities to achieve shared goals. In Chicago, he put together a Jewish-Muslim Arts Cafe series and convened Chicago's first iftar meal in a synagogue sukkah as a community organizer for the Jewish Council on Urban Affairs. In New York City, Rabbi Guy has organized religious voices in support of social services, marriage equality, and affordable housing as Director of Social Justice for Congregation B'nai Jeshurun. Rabbi Guy earned a BA summa cum laude in English from Princeton University in 1996. He then went on to complete his studies at the Jewish Theological Seminary with rabbinic ordination in 2013. Recognizing, in his own words, that Jewish prayer can be the most difficult and confounding, yet potentially transformative, of Judaism's spiritual practices, he also earned an MA in liturgy. As a community rabbi, he proudly participates in local organizations, including the Upper Manhattan Interfaith Leaders Coalition, and serves on the Rabbinical Council for Jews for Radical and Economic Justice. Rabbi Guy today lives in Washington Heights in New York City with his family. Again, Rabbi, welcome to Open Heart Conversations. And we're going to begin with a very, very simple question. It's our understanding, rabbi means teacher. Now, what inspired you to become a rabbi? What inspired you to become a teacher in your community?
Well, it wasn't always in the plans for me. I spent much of my teens and 20s being non-traditionally observant, not necessarily interested in my Jewish identity, and it's something that I came back to as a young adult, as I came to become more thoughtful about and more rooted in where I come from and where I'm going. And for me, a lot of that comes from the fact that all four of my grandparents survived the Holocaust, and I grew up with those stories. They were the kind of survivors who do talk about it, and I learned and absorbed from an early age both the terror of those times and also that it didn't come out of nowhere, that the Holocaust was something that emerged over a years-long period of attacks on civil rights and dehumanization of Jews and other minority groups. And so I learned that that's not inevitable. And I came to feel it as a personal mission of mine to build strong Jewish communities. But that's not just about preserving the past or some kind of golden era or some kind of rigid vision of what Judaism, was once and shall ever be. But building strong Jewish communities means building living Jewish communities in the real world, in real time. And for me, that also means building partnerships with other faith communities and other ethnic communities and minority communities, because I think that Jews are safer in societies that are democratic, that are just, that are equitable, that are open and tolerant, and not just tolerant, but embracing of plurality and multiplicity. And there are lots of groups that are interested in having that kind of society in the United States and elsewhere. So I've always looked to pursue those partnerships and to bring Jewish communities into those partnerships. I eventually decided to pursue that as a rabbi and as a congregational rabbi, because working with congregations is just, for me, the most beautiful, integrated and holistic way to be a spiritual community and to practice a religious path. Certainly not the only one. It happens to suit my temperament and my skill set. But something I enjoy about it is that we really get to understand Judaism as a way of life, right? And that we pray together, we look out for each other, we teach one another about our tradition, we evolve our tradition, we raise our children together, we celebrate holidays, we mourn together, we have joy together, and we also pursue a more just society together. And all of those things are part of a whole. And it's congregations where you get to do a little of everything, and I have loved that.
Well, thank you. It's been wonderful getting to know you. We met each other through the Interfaith Coalition in Washington Heights, and Washington Heights certainly is a unique marketplace with a lots of different cultures. Something that we somewhat share. My grandfather was a survivor of the Holocaust. Sadly, his 4 brothers and their families were not. So I have a heritage and a sensitivity to the past, and concerned about, like you, not repeating it and seeing how that doesn't happen to all people. And that's a lot of the work that we're doing collectively in the Heights, and also through this program, we're actually reaching out around the world. So thank you very much. Wonderful introduction for you. Tell us about Fort Tryon Jewish Center. It's called itself not affiliated with a denomination, and it was and remains an independent congregation, proud to be a religion home for people of various Jewish backgrounds. Say a little bit more about that, which I find that very intriguing.
Sure. I'll speak a bit about our congregation in particular, and then a little more broadly. So the Fort Tryon Jewish Center has been rooted in Washington Heights since its founding in 1938 by a diverse group of Jews, some of whom were refugees from Nazi Germany. And they had a kind of pluralistic and open idea about the kind of local Jewish community that they wanted to build. And they, being very much an immigrant neighborhood and an immigrant congregation, even at that time, a mix of native-born Americans and immigrant and refugee Jews, our congregation has always been committed to that vision of this neighborhood as a haven for immigrants, refugees, and asylum seekers. That is part of our congregational story and, of course, our neighborhood story. The congregation, from its founding, did not belong to any denomination. They just were independent-minded. They did have, for many decades, only Orthodox rabbis, Orthodox prayer books. Men and women sat together, but only men were allowed on the bima, which is the the raised area for performance of ritual roles, and only men could participate in those. That didn't change actually until 2007, and since then, the congregation has embraced gender egalitarianism for people of all gender identities and sexual orientations, as well as maintained a very traditional liturgical ritual with a strong emphasis on traditional observance of mitzvot, that is, of commandments or of Jewish spiritual imperatives, including Shabbat, the Sabbath, kashrut, the dietary laws, and modes of doing tefillah, which is prayer. So we now call ourselves an independent, traditional, egalitarian congregation. We see ourselves as drawing on strengths of various streams and movements within Judaism and within the Jewish people, also pursuing a particular path, which again is that traditional egalitarianism, which it's important to say, we don't see traditional observance of the mitzvot, of the commandments, and gender egalitarianism as things that are in opposition or in tension or one being a deviation from the other. We see egalitarianism as an unfolding of the tradition, really as an expansion of traditional Judaism to expand its circle to include an ever wider number of Jews, both in ritual rites and leadership roles, but also in ritual obligation and commandedness. So it's been an interesting path and a special one, and
how remarkable,
and a challenging one, also a living one that's great to be a part of.
And how important right now, and at any time. Jose?
Rabbi, when folks speak of Judaism as a tradition, as a faith, we hear words like reform, renewal, orthodox, conservative, Hasidic, to express as expressions, different expressions, if you will, of the Jewish faith and the Jewish tradition. Can you tell us what these terms mean and how these expressions really are defined?
Sure, and thanks for the question. I think it's important for folks to understand that there is no one Judaism. There are many different streams and movements. It's a historically evolving and living tradition, which has always had diversity within it. Denominations, as we know them, are really a very modern Western formation that didn't exist until the mid-1800s in Germany for Jews. And in a nutshell, the story is that a number of rabbis at that time in place had a series of conferences, which they referred to as reform. And they were interested in things like the incorporation of their vernacular, which was German, and questioning other kind of tenets of the faith, but incorporating modern scholarship and things like that. And that wasn't a denomination, it was a series of conferences. In reaction to that, there was a kind of traditionalist reaction which came to take the shape of what we now call orthodoxy, which itself has many, many different streams and movements within it. Once you had reform and orthodoxy, another group grew up which said, the tradition has historically unfolded. That isn't new. There has always been that kind of reform, if that's what you want to call it, or evolution. But some folks take it too far, let's say. And that kind of historicist school of Judaism eventually evolved into what's now called conservative. There are other denominations now. One is called Reconstructionist, one is called Renewal, and that's the basic story. But it's really a kind of institutionalization that tracks with the way that religion lives in Western Christian societies in some ways. Hasidism is a phenomenon of its own. Hasidism started in the 1700s, mostly in Eastern Europe, as a kind of populist spiritual revival movement among Jews, which was partly in reaction to an emphasis on Talmud study and text study in yeshivas, and was partly about bringing mystical ideas, Kabbalistic ideas, and popular spirituality, a strong emphasis on prayer, a strong emphasis on experience of the divine rather than study of the divine. Those two things are not really necessarily a dichotomy, but it was a popular movement, and over time it took on its own institutional forms and became dynastic, in which rebbes, who were rabbis that were more like guru figures, would pass on leadership of their group to sons or students. And it took its own course from there. Today, Hasidism, I would say, has two main streams. One is what we would say falls under orthodoxy. It is not egalitarian, and then the other is a kind of liberal Hasidism, sometimes referred to as neo-Hasidism, in which many of the approaches and the mysticism and the kind of popular experiential spirituality has been brought into an egalitarian framework among liberal Jews.
So please correct me if I'm wrong, but essentially what you're saying seems to be that Judaism is much like many other very long enduring religious traditions in that it has a richness of spiritualities and spiritual expression, philosophy, theology, and even historical expressions. Am I correct?
Yes. Yeah.
Excellent. Thank you.
With all that, one of the concepts of Judaism is the concept of one God. I'd like you to talk about one God, your perception of one God, and also just curious, with some of those different variations, is one God still core to the Jewish tradition or traditions and faiths?
Yes, absolutely. It's so fundamental that it's almost hard to speak about it. And all streams and movements of Judaism embrace that oneness as a fundamental assumption. Right? But as always, we have different ideas about the path to the one and what that oneness means for us, and what is the right way to respond to the oneness that is the ground of all being.
Many scholars would say that Moses constituted, if you will, the founding voice of the Jewish tradition. Tell us a little bit about Moses and his place in Jewish history.
Well, Moses is an incredibly complex figure as he's portrayed in the Torah. Of course, it's hard to summarize, and in his story, he has different stages of his life in which different aspects of his personality and his leadership are more prominent than others, or evolving themselves. He's a flawed leader, like all of the founders of our spiritual path as depicted in the Torah. I think one thing that's important about Moses is that he's referred to later, right, in the post-biblical period as Moshe Rabbeinu, Moshe our rabbi, right? And so rabbinic Judaism, which is actually Judaism as we know it, and we can talk about that some more. Rabbinic Judaism sees Moshe not just as a prophet or a priest figure or a communal leader, but as a rabbi, as a teacher, right? As someone who tried to convey to the people, to the best of his ability, what is God's will for us for how to live an ethical, a sacred, and a holy life in this world, right? And the Torah is a foundational guide for how to do that. And so Moshe is seen as the teacher of the Torah, the first one in that way.
But in a sense, please correct me again if you see it differently, but there seems to be within the history a sense that Moses had a unique experience and relationship to, if you will, that ground of being, to what we all in the Abrahamic traditions refer to as God. he had some extraordinary experience of God. Is that your understanding?
Yes, that's the traditional understanding that is expressed in the book of Numbers, that right, of all the prophets, Moshe is the one whom God speaks to face. We say that even the greatest of the other prophets were able to perceive God only through a darkened lens or a clouded lens, and Moshe was the only one who could perceive God through a clear and a transparent lens. But of course, Moshe's own experience of God is also limited and mediated. The well-known scene on Mount Sinai where Moshe pleads with God for a more intimate revelation of God's self, and God says, but you're still human and you can't perceive me in my fullness and live. And Moshe has to hide in the cleft of the rock and have only a partial theophany, a partial appearance of the divine being. I think that's not necessarily need to be analyzed literally, but I think Moshe in that sense is one of the paradigmatic spiritual seekers, right, who is active in the world, right? Very important. He has his mountaintop moments, right? But mostly Moshe is deeply immersed in the life of the Jewish people and in politics, right? As a younger man, he's someone who gives up his privilege as a prince of Egypt and identifies with his people and liberates the oppressed from a structure of oppression that had seemed to be eternal, divinely authorized, and immovable. And he brought them out of that. He engages in communal and national leadership at the highest levels and in the most challenging times.
Right.
At the same time, he's an individual human being with his own spiritual longings, right? And his own doubts and questions, his own deep desire for a relationship with God. I think that's very powerful and very, right, that we don't look to Moses only as this kind of extraordinary, exceptional person who we can't model from. We also look to him as a paradigmatic seeker whom all of us have what to learn from.
Absolutely.
You mentioned the term prophet and that he was one of the prophets. What are prophets, and how does Moses fit into that realm?
Right. Well, one way to think about prophecy is that it's someone whom God speaks to, right? And so by that definition, Moshe is seen as one of the prophets, but certainly not the first and not the last. But I think something important about prophet is that term in popular usage, we think of it as either someone who's like seeing the future, predicting the future, this is what's going to happen, that's what prophecy. But I don't think that actually applies to many of the prophets as we have them in the Bible or in other sacred texts. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel, one of the great 20th century Jewish philosophers and leaders, spoke about a prophet as someone who sees us as God sees us. Just catches a glimpse, even briefly, of how God sees us and tries to convey that to us. So sometimes that takes the form of speaking truth to power and letting us know about our hypocrisy and our shortcomings, and really letting us know that God sees and God isn't fooled by our rationalizations and our escapism. But it also often means that prophets are often speaking to us about God's love for us and comforting us, consoling us, reassuring us that our covenantal relationship with God has not been broken and cannot be broken. And so often you see that in the prophets, this kind of back and forth between the love and the reassurance and the rebuke and the calling to account. They go together.
That's lovely. That's lovely. I've never heard the definition quite put that beautifully. So thank you. Tell me also about the term "the chosen people," because I grew up hearing that term a lot. About the chosen people. What does that mean?
Sure. I think it's a term that is easily misunderstood both by Jews and Gentiles, and so I appreciate you asking about it. I think what it means is that the Jewish people, we see ourselves as having a special relationship with God. Not the only relationship by any means, but a particular one. It's a particular path. It's our path. We understand it as a covenantal relationship in which both we and the Holy One have obligations to one another, to love one another, to stick by each other through good times and bad. We see ourselves, part of our chosenness for the Jewish people has been to receive the Torah, to receive mitzvot, commandments, or as I sometimes translate, Jewish spiritual imperatives. And some of those mitzvot are ones that we share in common with other religious paths who also, feel compelled by those principles, but some of them are particular to us. How we understand Shabbat, the Sabbath, for example. Those are things that are particular to the path that we understand God as having called us to. Not a better path, it's a particular one. For us, it's the best one, right? But that we think suits us as a people, whether we like it or not. And Prophet Amos tells us that God has chosen other people and brought other people out from other lands. And, we know that everyone has their path and their relationship. But I think that it's a mistake to totally give up on the concept of chosenness, because I think, as I said, we are chosen to our particular path. And it's an important one. One of my teachers is Rabbi Marsha Prager, and she once put it in the sense that Judaism and Jews are essential to the religious ecosystem of humanity, right? We're part of that religious ecosystem. Not the only part, not the most important part, certainly not the biggest part. But there is something essential about us and our path that if, God forbid, it were to be snuffed out, the human religious ecosystem would be not only deeply impoverished, but maybe couldn't stand.
That's beautiful. That's absolutely remarkable. Thank you so much, Rabbi. One of the I've heard historians at times say that part of what's kept the Jewish people alive is that they are the people of a story. That the idea of story, the idea of is so central to the Jewish identity, and story specifically as it's written. In other words, the Jewish scripture is so important. So let's explore that a little bit. Let's begin with the beginning. What is Torah?
It's a question that's hard to answer. So obviously, there's the 5 books of Moses, which we refer to as the Torah. It's a part of the Bible. There's the Torah scroll, right, which is written on animal parchment, sewn on sheets, sewn together with thread that comes from tendons, is written on with a special kind of black ink, and is rolled up on wooden spindles, which are called atzei chaim, which means trees of life. And so that's the Torah scroll, right? But beyond that, we in English we refer to Torah without the article the in front of it. Torah, broadly speaking, is the ongoing Jewish conversation about the revelation of God's will for how we might live in this world. So we speak about Torah as, it's not abstract because it's a real conversation, but it goes well beyond the 5 books of Moses, and it is always unfolding through the Talmud and other parts of rabbinic literature, through the Zohar and mystical texts, all the way through to the sermon that a rabbi gave in the synagogue the other day.
So in a
that's
sense,
all Torah.
That's interesting, because please correct me if I'm wrong, then as our listeners and our viewers are experiencing you as a teacher within the tradition, are we experiencing, in essence, Torah?
Well, we would say you're hearing a little bit of my Torah.
Excellent.
And it's very important to say that my Torah is very situated in my identity and experience. Now, you've brought me on as a kind of expert, and I'm authorized by my rabbis to be a teacher and to speak on these subjects, but I'm only who I am. I'm 46. I immigrated from Israel as a baby with my Israeli-born parents. I grew up in suburban Cleveland. I'm usually located as white in the racial system of the United States. I'm a queer man married to a woman, raising a family in New York City. I was ordained in the conservative denomination. And something that's really important is that everyone has Torah, right? We say that, there are a lot of Jewish teachings that speak about there being 70 faces of Torah, or that the number of letters in the Torah corresponds to the number of Jews at any given time, such that Torah cannot be complete without all of those faces, without all of those people, without all of those readers, right? If there's anyone who's not reading the Torah and sharing their understanding of it, then the Torah is incomplete. Part of the great project of contemporary Judaism has been to expand the readership of the Torah and the teaching of Torah to people who are quite different than me. Women, people of all genders, people of all sexual orientations and identities. There have always been, I'm also an Ashkenazi Jew, meaning I come from a particular cultural and liturgical and legal tradition, mostly rooted in Europe, but there's Sephardi, Mizrahi, there's Ethiopian, the Yemenite, there's many more. And so it's really, all of that is a way of saying, it's important to understand that what I'm sharing is my Torah. It's my understanding.
Right.
But it's so incomplete. And I can't actually speak for everyone. That would be ridiculous on its face, and actually counter to our understanding of Torah.
And that's an important statement. It's important for all our listeners and our viewers to understand that the richness and the complexity. But at least you're giving us, as you said, one perspective, and an important one. What is Talmud? Well,
the Talmud is the core foundational text of rabbinic Judaism. So when we say the rabbis, we usually mean the rabbis of the first few centuries of the Common Era, who were the authors and editors and the sources of the teachings contained in the Talmud. There are actually 2 Talmuds. One's called the Babylonian Talmud. That's what we usually mean when we say the Talmud. There's also a version that was edited and codified in the land of Israel. It's called the Jerusalem Talmud. The rabbis tell an origin stories about themselves, which in a nutshell is something like this. When the Romans occupied the land of Israel, what the Romans called Palestine, in the first decades of the first century of the Common Era and laid siege to Jerusalem. The small circle of the earliest rabbis that were active in Jerusalem at the time, were led by a man named Yochanan ben Zakkai, who had himself smuggled in a coffin out of the city walls into the camp of the general Vespasian. Because Yochanan ben Zakkai saw the writing on the wall that Jerusalem would be destroyed, that the temple would be destroyed, he was able to persuade, to gain an audience with Vespasian, and to say famous words, "Give me Yavne and its sages." What is Yavne? It's like a little town closer to the coast in the land of Israel. And Yochanan ben Zakkai, according to the story, founded a school of Torah there with his disciples. And they raised up more disciples and grew and built the rabbinic community in the absence of the temple and the priesthood. Around the year 200, a Jewish rabbinic and communal leader named Rabbi Yehuda Hanasi, in English, Judah the Prince. Prince means that he was also a communal leader as well as a religious leader, decided to write down traditions of Torah that until then had only been passed on orally. So we speak about the written Torah, that's the 5 books of Moses and other parts of the Bible, and the oral Torah, which is also part of Revelation, but had not been written down until about the year 200. That compilation of halakha, of Jewish law or Jewish practices and life ways, is called the Mishnah, which means something like the teaching. Okay? And it's organized into 60-some different areas of Jewish life and practice. Some of it was probably centuries old in terms of describing how Jews actually lived according to their understanding of the Torah, and some of it was probably more innovative and prescriptive about how to live in the absence of the temple and the priesthood. So now the Talmud. It's often said incorrectly that the Talmud is a commentary on the Torah. It's not the case. The Talmud is a commentary on the Mishnah. In other words, as soon as the Mishnah gets codified around the year 200, all the rabbis and their students are like, well, what does that mean, right? It says here that Rabbi so-and-so said that, on the Sabbath, you should do this. Well, what did he mean? What if this was the case or that were the case? And this language is ambiguous, and what are we really supposed to mean by it? And so the conversation just continues for more generations. Eventually, 300-400 years later, those conversations and additional teachings, as well as stories, as well as exegesis of biblical verses, jokes, recipes, like it's really a cornucopia, gets compiled into the Babylonian Talmud and the Jerusalem Talmud. As soon as those are closed, more rabbis and their students are studying those texts and saying, well, what does that mean? Well, that doesn't really cover my life, right? Or this other situation that I had. In fact, let me tell you a story that undermines the whole principle that we just learned, right? And so that suggests that specific circumstances might lead to a different legal conclusion. So 2 things are important about that. One is that the conversation is still going. Judaism has never been closed. There's no contemporary Judaism that is anything like Judaism was in the past, because conversation goes on. The interpretation, the discussion, the learning from our life experience, the discerning from our life and dialogue with our sacred texts and teachings, how to live in our time, in our place, what God might want from us now, here. The second thing that's important about that is there is an anti-Semitic polemic which comes from Christianity that Judaism is a legalistic and a hair-splitting tradition, right? What does that mean? That is a very nasty way of describing what for us is a never-ending conversation about how every moment and every circumstance is different. Every person's life and experience, every context that we find ourselves in is slightly different from another, right? And so part of the Jewish path and practice is that ongoing discernment. There's always another case, there's always a nuance which calls on us to think deeply and feel our way through what God might want from us, right? And what is sometimes thought of as a legal tradition is really a tradition of practice, right? There's a lot of theology in Judaism, but where we kind of put a lot of our emphasis is the practical expression or manifestation or consequence of that theology, of that understanding of the Holy Blessed One and God's desire for us to live in alignment, right? So practice is, what do you do? How should you live? What should you do right now in this situation? That's what we call halacha, which is poorly translated as Jewish law, but really is Jewish practice.
It's interesting because my next question was going to be, what is the place of Jewish scriptures in the life of a observant Jewish person? And in a sense, you really have described it. It's really an avenue to continuously participate in that dialogue, which is a continuous exploration of how to live a full, holy human life.
Yes, very much. So the place of Jewish scripture certainly is partly a guide to living a sacred life. There's a couple other aspects I would say. One is the study of those scriptures, and not just of scripture like the Bible or the Talmud, but of the whole evolving conversation that I've been trying to describe, right? Study of Torah writ large. Study is a way in which we understand ourselves as experiencing God and uncovering God's ongoing revelation. So humans have a very empowered and active role in Judaism in interpreting and unfolding, being partners with God in the unfolding of revelation, and even really of the work of creating the world, which didn't end after 7 days. Scripture, as you know, for sure, in every path, is also what I would call sacred master narratives to live inside of, right? Certainly it's part of raising children inside of those, what we call like stories, right? But they're sacred master narratives that help us to make sense of the world and our place in it, that resonate with our experiences, that we find ourselves aligned with or we differentiate ourselves from. It's a source of language to inspire us to understand ourselves by. So we have our sacred master narratives and other paths have theirs, but I think that humans need that on a very deep level.
When you reflect on many of those master narratives, when you reflect on the Jewish tradition, what would you say are some of the most important teachings? What are some of the most important tenets that are central to the Jewish faith?
Great. So we spoke a little bit about oneness. We spoke a little bit about mitzvah, which is commandedness, right? The way that obligation and responsibility is a core part of the Jewish religious path and understanding. We talked about halacha, which is the ongoing conversation of mitzvot, of commandments, spiritual imperatives. how to actually live them out in different situations, how to elevate the mundane to the sacred, how to experience God's presence, how to become better, more ethical, compassionate individuals, how to build stronger, more ethical and compassionate communities. That's mitzvah and halacha. We spoke a little bit about the human role in ongoing revelation and its interpretation. I think that's a really important part of Jewish self-understanding. And one more that I would point to is the idea that a better world is possible. I think, so this is sometimes referred to as messianism, but it's bigger than that. It's the idea that there is history, that time doesn't only move in cycles, but it also spirals forward. And so what we think of as spiritual evolution, historical evolution, progress, God willing, right? Maybe not linear, maybe that's not always constant or consistent, but the idea that we are going somewhere, that there is a direction to all of this, I think is a core Jewish idea. And not just that we're going somewhere, but that we're going somewhere better. And we have an active role to play in getting there, right? That God's will is not just about what we do in our daily, weekly, monthly, yearly lives, but about the direction of the overall human project, which is a direction towards love, towards empathy, towards compassion, towards justice, towards life, the ability to live, okay? The ability for each human being to manifest themselves as a vehicle of the divine presence in this material world. And I think that the divine being or energy in the universe inclines us that way, wants us to go that way. A better world is possible, and we can head that direction.
Your message is very timely right now, given where we are in the world, and also right now as we are recording this session, it's fall, and it's beginning of times of many high holy days. Tell us about some of the Jewish traditions that people may have heard of or maybe haven't heard of in the holidays.
About the high holidays that are coming up?
Yeah.
Okay. So the two main ones are Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur. In brief, Rosh Hashanah means the head of the year. It's the new year of the Jewish calendar. But on a broader and deeper level, it is understood as the anniversary of the creation of the universe. So it is a time for recognizing creation, recognizing our createdness, recognizing the ongoing active presence of the Creator, whose partner we are privileged to be in the ongoing creation of the world. And understanding that Creator is one, that the Creator's oneness is the basis for God's sovereignty over all of humanity and over all of creation. And that we need to remind ourselves, what does that mean for us? We can be amazed, we can have wonder at all that is, and how we're a part of it, an interdependent, interconnected part of it. We can feel gratitude for the abundance of life and love that the divine infuses us in our world. Then, once we've been through wonder and gratitude, we have to ask ourselves, how do we respond? How do we live? And that's the turn towards Yom Kippur, when we are having recognized oneness and sovereignty and unity and createdness, we say, well, what about me, right? We are supposed to be examining our lives, examining our actions and our deeds and our attitudes really from a whole month before Rosh Hashanah up through Yom Kippur, a period of 40 days, and really taking stock and doing what we call teshuvah. Teshuvah is a key word for understanding the Jewish high holidays. It's often translated as repentance. That's one valence of its meaning, but it more broadly literally means return. It's a return to alignment, a return to relationship with ourselves, with one another, with the Holy Blessed One. It's a kind of calling ourselves to account for how we live and how we fall short and how we want to challenge ourselves to do better. And that is a pretty incredible spiritual project.
Wonderful.
That's what's going on these days.
Pretty amazing couple time coming up. And just touch on the other sort of major holidays. And I'd love you then to talk a little bit about the Sabbath. What is the Sabbath and what does that mean?
Sure. So the annual cycle, which has its climax in Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, also has a parallel cycle, if that's the right word, of the three pilgrimage festivals from the Torah, which are Pesach, Shavuot, and Sukkot, which is to say Passover, what's called in English sometimes the Feast of Weeks, and the Feast of Booths or Tabernacles, I think it's called. And right, that have origins in the annual harvest cycle, but also commemorate respectively the liberation from slavery and oppression, the giving and receiving of the Torah at Mount Sinai, and God's protection of us as we wandered and lived in huts in the wilderness, which is a reminder that that's actually still the human condition, right? That as much as we think, we have these nice buildings now, and we have such a wonderful society and all these structures that we like to believe give us security, one thing that we remind ourselves on the high holidays, just before Sukkot, the Feast of Booths comes, a few days later, our lives are actually quite fragile and quite vulnerable. And we should incorporate that understanding into how to live. So there's that annual cycle. Now, you asked me about Shabbat, the Sabbath, Shabbat, or in Yiddish Ashkenazi pronunciation, Shabbos. Shabbat or Shabbos is the weekly holiday. So what is Shabbat? I think that Shabbat is best understood not as a day on its own, but in relation to the 6 days of the week. Right? They really go together, 6 days and the Sabbath. Space versus time, right? In the 6 days, we're very active in the world of space, of doing, of controlling, of improving, of working the land, working at our jobs, right? Being God's partners in the creation of the world. And on the 7th day, we take on a kind of humility, a restraint. We stop trying to create and control. We pause to appreciate what's created. And to remember that although during the 6 days of the week, it's never enough, right? There's brokenness in the world that needs to be repaired. There is creation that needs to be continued. We're still trying to get to Messiah time, right? To that world to come, that world that is coming into being. But we can't do that every day. And part of the humility of Shabbat is to recognize that if I were to spend an extra day a week doing that work, it still wouldn't be done. It's actually quite arrogant to think that, right? And so we need to take that step back. We need to restore and recharge ourselves, rest, appreciate, praise, be in community, right? In order to go back out into the next 6 days. But in that rest and that restraint, while we're pausing from the journey towards the world to come, we are actually also experiencing it, a foretaste of it. A world of abundance, a world of community, a world of just being together, right? A world in which conflicts are resolved and are unfold. A world of more readily available, palpable presence of the divine all around us. That's what we're trying to create on the Sabbath. And so we sometimes misunderstand Shabbat as a time of restriction. Right? There are a lot of laws and like a lot of things that we don't do on Shabbat. So in traditional Judaism, we don't write, we don't do anything that's like agricultural labor to bring things forth from the ground. We don't engage in commerce, money, the give and take of the busyness of the world. We rest. Those restrictions are not, it's not asceticism. It's not it's not an end in itself. Those restrictions are actually a way of holding the pressures of the world at bay to allow us to hold open this kind of Shabbat bubble, to rest, to be humble, to appreciate. And we need that because those pressures are so strong.
That's lovely. Thank you for clarifying that. That's very helpful. Talk a little bit about the role of the synagogue.
Well, the synagogue is a central institution of Jewish life. We talk about it as a Beit Knesset, a house of assembly, a Beit Midrash, a house of study, and a Beit Tefillah, a house of prayer. Fulfills so many spiritual and communal purposes, as do houses of worship and congregational life and in other paths. It's a place where we raise kids. And so, what happens in a synagogue on Shabbat, but there's also daily. There's prayer, there's Torah reading and Torah study. But there's also a lot of schmoozing and kibitzing and nashing, which in translation means talking and chatting and eating. There's a famous old joke about, Jews go to shul. Shul is a word for synagogue in Yiddish. Jews go to shul for lots of different reasons, right? My friend Schwartz, he goes to shul to talk to God. Me, I go to shul to talk to Schwartz.
There had to be a joke in this session, so thank you for that.
Yeah.
We have to share this because I'm hoping that Tuto, when we put this together, we'll play some of the music that you performed in the Interfaith Music Festival. Can you talk about that celebration, because that was so exquisite.
Sometimes people who are coming from outside of Jewish communities, when they come to visit a synagogue, and every synagogue has different culture, but often Often the culture in the synagogue is very informal relative to some other expressions. People may be surprised to see, well, some people are praying in their seats. Seems like people are not all on the same page. These folks are walking around. These folks are talking in the back. There is that kind of lively communal informality about it, especially in some traditional communities. That is, I think, part of the joy and the charm of Jewish communal life. It's also important, I think, in the context of this conversation, to remember that Judaism is not just a quote-unquote faith. It's not just a quote-unquote religion, right? It is, yes, it is one of the world's great ancient wisdom traditions, and it is an ongoing religious civilization that, thank God, has lasted for thousands of years, and please God, many more. But the idea of Judaism as a faith with particular tenets, right? And if you're Jewish, you believe, right? Is kind of really a sort of a modern and Western conception. The term Judaism is not indigenous to our tradition. There's no word for it in ancient or traditional literature. And we talk about, not in terms of a noun, but in terms of verbs. Right? Shmor v'la'asot, to keep and to do. The mitzvot under the covenant, right? We talk about la'avod et Hashem, to serve God, or avodat Hashem, divine service. That's what Jews do in our particular way. But we are a people who does that. Right? So Judaism is not just a religious faith, it's a people. The synagogue is the microcosm of that peoplehood. But we always have a sense of ourselves as connected to a people. Now, it's not only ethnic. There are many different Jewish ethnicities and cultures. It's very global and diverse, and people of all colors, and so on, and speaking many different languages. You also don't have to be born Jewish. You can convert and become Jewish, but that means more than just taking on certain beliefs and practices. Even converts become, by choice, a part of the Jewish people. We see ourselves as a people with a connection to a particular land, and that just, I think, has deep resonances for how we understand ourselves, for how we survive, and also for how, in an interfaith context, I think that Judaism is a wisdom tradition that has a lot to offer to seekers and to students of world traditions, but I don't think that it can be borrowed from in a way that has, through my eyes, integrity, right? Meaning it's a path pursued by a people, and it has its own integrity. Yes, actually, there has always been influence and syncretism, and Jews and Christians and Muslims and others who we've lived alongside have learned a lot from each other and absorbed a lot from each other. But each path has its own integrity, and I think needs to be respected as such.
Rabbi, as our time together slowly comes to a close, we're living in remarkably challenging times. As you reflect on those times and you reflect on exactly what you've just speaking to, that unique voice that the Jewish tradition brings to the world, what do you think your tradition, as you've come to understand it, as you've come to live it, what does that tradition have to say to the modern world, facing these unique challenges that we're faced with today?
Well, I'll say two things. One is that we already touched on, which is that a better world is possible, that we are going somewhere. We are taking this human project in partnership with God in a better direction. That's our work, and it is possible. And God is with us when we are doing that. There is brokenness, and we can repair it. There is harm, and we can heal it, some of it. We each have our piece of that work to do over time and in every place. We're not to be passive, we're to be active in that journey. And that's a source of hope, it's a source of energy. It's more than faith. It's like a deep-seated knowledge. And I think it can give us confidence. And it certainly should get us off our butts, because that work is our responsibility.
Absolutely.
Now, I was speaking recently with a woman who is going through a journey of her own right now. She's a cancer patient. And she said to not just to me, but to a group of her supporters, that she's been learning that it's not about the destination, right? That we know. We often say, it's not about the destination, it's about the journey. This woman said to us, it's also not just really about the journey. It's about the company along the way. I thought this was a deep teaching. It's about the company. And Judaism urges us to be with people, to recognize that life is with people. There's a place for solitude. There's a place for the individual seeker. There's a place for that. But the bigger picture is community and humanity. We've been talking a lot these days about whether or not we're really in the same boat, right? In this pandemic, a lot of us have wanted to say, this is bringing us together, right? We're all in the same boat. We're all in the same boat. And other people have said, we are obviously not in the same boat, right? Some of us are barely hanging on to a very flimsy life raft. And others of us are having drinks on our private yachts. Don't talk to me about the same boat. Right? And I think both positions have a deep truth. There's another metaphor about boats, which is a teaching by one of the ancient sages, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai. He says, he has I think, a better metaphor about boats. If we're looking for the right one, I think this is the one we need right now. Because the situation we're in is analogous to taking two boats or multiple boats and binding them together on the surface of the water, binding them together with beams and ropes and planks and ties and bonds. And on those boats, you can build a palace. What is the palace? The palace is the world, right? The palace is a world in which the sovereign's presence can reside. The palace is a world in which God's sovereignty can endure, right? And so our role as Jews, and our role as, I don't presume to say what others should do, but I think it's applicable. Our role is to bind the boats together. We might not always be in the same boat. Our boats might not always be the same, but we can bind our boats together. And we have to do that. We have to proactively reach out to one another and break through our isolation, our segregation, all the division that we have, which is a distraction from our unity. That unity is something that doesn't just exist. It's something that we have to make real by binding ourselves to one another. And that's how we get where we're going.
Rabbi, if anyone wanted to get more information, anyone wanted to learn more and understand more the Jewish tradition, what would you recommend they do?
In terms of reading?
Reading, other activities they might undertake.
Great. So when we're able to be together again in our congregations, I certainly think it's great to arrange a visit. You know, congregations will respond differently to walk-ins.
Right.
But it is always, I think, just more respectful to arrange a visit in advance by reaching out. As an individual or with a group from your congregation, maybe make time to also talk with the rabbi, afterwards and reflect on what you've experienced. So that's for future time. I would love to host people. I know many rabbis and congregations are excited to do that. In terms of reading, if I would point to one kind of general reference that I think would resonate with many of the listeners or viewers of Unity Radio, there's a wonderful book called A Book of Life, Embracing Judaism as a Spiritual Practice by Rabbi Michael Strassfeld, and really speaks about Jewish practice and customs in an accessible and resonant language of contemporary spirituality as a system of spiritual practice and what some people call spiritual technology. I think it's very beautifully done, and I recommend it. I think for those who want to start to understand the deep impact of feminism and also of the LGBTQ movement on our world and on Judaism and on the Jewish people, a great place to start is a book called Standing Again at Sinai. Maybe it's called Standing at Sinai, by Judith Plaskow, who's one of the most important theologians and thinkers of the contemporary period. It can't be understated, the impact of feminism and queer thought on contemporary Judaism today. And the last one I would recommend is Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel. There's an important and accessible thin volume called The Sabbath, and also a collection of essays called Moral Grandeur and Spiritual Audacity, which really articulates a kind of theology and philosophy of Judaism as responsibility, and how do we live ethically in the world that we find ourselves in.
Rabbi, thank you for an absolutely magnificent time with you. This has been a phenomenal dialogue. I am so very grateful. We are also very grateful for the privilege you've given us to walk this path with you this past hour. Thank you so very, very much.
Thank you so much for the holy work that you are doing and helping to bind the boats together and help us to learn about and from one another. Thank you.
Thank you. Bishop Shea, thank you, sweet sister, for this magnificent time.
Thank you all. It's been an extraordinary hour. And thank you all for listening and watching.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners and our viewers, thank you for participating in this ongoing dialogue on the enduring faith traditions of the world. Take care.